Thanks, and again, welcome to this webinar. And I'm going to give you some insight about what it means to be successful with distributed projects, with distributed teams, globally speaking, distributed management. And as from the introduction, I've been working myself in global responsibilities over the past 20 years and have been leading teams, have moved some international organizations to CMMI level 5. I have directed globally distributed projects with some 100 people working on it, and at the moment do a lot of consulting projects in the Americas, in Europe, and also in Asia, specifically China, Korea, Japan, and India. So I bring a broad cross-culture experience, but as so often, it's not really something where you find one dimension which fits everything. But as we are going to learn in this webinar, there are several dimensions related to culture, related to collaboration, related to communication, which I'm trying to summarize in order to give you some hands-on guidance for practical global software projects. Now, if you look into the typical setup of global projects, what we see is it all boils down into topics such as teamwork projects, but behind the scenes, there's also a lot of things like process, communication, collaboration. The catchwords which you see here in this wordle are actually coming from about 10 years of the leading conference on global software projects, which is the IEEE International Conference on Global Software Engineering. And we have done some longitudinal research across all articles. And this is the relationship of substantives inside the different articles over these 10 years. And that gives you quite interesting, say, setup of how these different topics are related. Now, we're going, of course, to also give you more advantage in terms of giving it some structure. And what we start is, of course, there is a huge benefit in a global setup. One is flexibility, because today most value creation is global endeavor. Even if the segments are getting smaller, the company and the reach of companies must be typically worldwide in the software sector. The second topic is innovation, because once we have a global footprint, we can learn a lot from local markets in different areas of the world. Number 3 is efficiency. And in terms of efficiency, it's typically a big lesson learned to get started in collaborative situations, because suddenly it forces you to be more process-minded, more interested in clearly specifying what you're doing, and then also do what you are doing more efficiently. So this is a cycle which fuels itself at the moment when you are successful in global projects. You would have more success because you gain efficiency, you gain flexibility, you gain access to distributed and scarce skills and competences, and that in turn makes you even more competitive. Vice versa, it's also clear that there's a dark side in terms of if you don't manage these 3 dimensions, then what we often see is that the challenges dominate, and in such situation, the circle suddenly is not anymore self-sustaining, but rather negative or vicious. And in such a vicious circle, what we realize is that cost can tremendously increase if you are not prepared for the global setup. To give you one example of a recent client situation, if you have 2-3 teams in 3 different geographic locations, even without much time zone split, if things run bad, what can easily happen is that you have a lot of rework, a lot of misunderstandings. We take typically as a rule of thumb that the additional cost, if you go into 2 to 3 centers, even captive, it doesn't really matter much whether it's captive or outsourced, you would have an overhead of 30 to 40%. which certainly will not be completely compensated only by wage improvements. I mean, that is naive to think that we still have these big gaps in terms of wages, and I should be happy to say that, because some 10 years ago, people would go offshore primarily for cost reasons. I think today we have learned that it's much more for competences, for flexibility, for innovativeness, the factors which I mentioned before. But you need to avoid the traps, and if that is not happening, then with what we see in many situations is that contracts are cancelled, 20% to our benchmark in the first year. About half do not deliver according to initial objectives. 80% of the IT companies with which we work claim that they are not fully satisfied with their distributed projects. And again, it's not really the distance which makes the difference. It is primarily the intercultural differences, the collaborative challenges, and having insufficient processes. And to take just another example, if you think about process, it's obvious if you work in one place, you can compensate by direct coffee corner speaking, by direct interaction with your colleague, for insufficient specifications, for insufficient test strategy, for insufficient idea about interfaces, handover points, etc. You would just go to your colleague, ask him, how did you do that? I currently work with a semiconductor company, which is one of the worldwide leaders, and they were used to work in a rather narrow geographic scope, and often when it came, for instance, towards how do we allocate memory space, who is going to take which part of the memory, a lot of these discussions were done in the coffee corner, were documented rather poorly, and then were just implemented, things worked. Suddenly they work now with an Eastern European supplier, and they realize this is not as trivial anymore, because a couple of the information is not available. The rationale behind, the design rationales are not clear, and they got lots of quality defects, and that is actually the cost I'm talking about. The 30 to 40% in average is really the friction cost, while it is still possible to reduce this 30-40% towards some 10-15%, but that works only if the companies really pay attention on process, on collaboration, and on culture aspects. In other words, what we can tell as a simple rule of thumb is global sourcing has numerous advantages, but at the same time multiply the risk in otherwise high-risk business. That's the underlying message which you should be aware of. Now, to summarize this list, I made it a top 10 list, which we typically update once per year. And the number one is, or let's say the number 1 and 2 is just insufficient project delivery in terms of schedule, in terms of quality. Number 3 is already a people issue, which is not to be underestimated. It's about culture clash, misunderstandings, etc. Then come a lot of topics related to staff turnover, to supplier services, etc. And then the other 5 is more related into the underlying technologies and competences. But this can, of course, then also be mitigated. And again, from the own project benchmarking database, but also from the past 10 years of this IEEE ICSI conference, what we have distilled is success factors and their benefits. If you recall, the 3 benefits were exactly what I mentioned earlier: flexibility, innovation, efficiency. The success factors is competence, which is a soft skill, is communication, which is a soft skill, and it is collaboration, which is also a hard skill. And this gives us 9 best practices, and these 9 best practices, as it turned out, have been numerously researched and communicated in a lot of different